The Smithy Gang is a very different type of villain than the ones I usually examine on this channel. Usually, we look at villains that are much more narrative focused. The Smithy Gang is what I would consider to be a much more traditional retro video game villain. The focus here is on gameplay rather than narrative. For that very reason, I thought it would be a fun challenge to try and analyze the Smithy Gang from a narrative perspective. Like, what makes this sort of video game villain tick? What choices are the developers making here? This will be a much shorter video than I normally post because the Smithy Gang are a much simpler antagonist than I usually analyze. So let's start at the start with the introduction of the Smithy Gang in the game. And I actually think the Smithy Gang have a super duper cool introduction. Without any setup whatsoever, out of nowhere, a truly colossal scale sword falls from the heavens, shattering the sky and embeds itself directly into Bowser's castle. That's a pretty good villainous debut. But from a narrative perspective, there's actually something interesting happening here. So let me ask you a question. Of all the places in the Mushroom Kingdom, why did the developers choose to have this giant sword fall on Bowser's castle? Why not on Peach's castle? Why not on top of Mario's house? Why not anywhere else? Well, one of the most important things a developer needs to do with any new villain, especially in a long-running series like Super Mario, is to make this new villain feel like a true threat. The new villain has to justify their existence in this world. Why are we fighting a new villain instead of the old one that we're used to? Why aren't we just fighting Bowser again? What's special about this new antagonist? They need to seem imposing, threatening, like a worthwhile and unique challenge. So the very first thing the Smithy Gang does is kick Bowser's butt. With a single thrust of their colossal sword in a single moment, the Smithy Gang obliterates Bowser. They destroy his evil empire and kick him out of his own castle. As the audience, we're supposed to see this and think to ourselves, oh my gosh, these guys are even stronger than Bowser? Whoa, this is gonna be a tough fight, uh-oh. From that perspective, this is a really effective introduction. As the game progresses, the Smithy Gang are usually presented as mischievous rather than outright evil. They are the trickster archetype. Think of Loki from Norse mythology or Puck from Shakespeare's A Midsummer Night's Dream. They make a lot of trouble, cause a lot of problems, but don't usually actually hurt anyone. The problems they cause are temporary in nature and often easily fixed. For example, one of the first members of the Smithy Gang you encounter is Clay Morton, a sort of pogo stick sword thing. When Clay Morton invades the Mushroom Kingdom, his soldiers don't really hurt anyone or even do any damage. They just sort of bounce around. They're more zany and silly and annoying than actually dangerous. And of course they aren't. This is a game whose primary audience are children. And even more important than that, it's a game designed to be fun to play first and everything else second. The developers don't want to challenge the audience with scenes of suffering and anguish, aren't trying to plumb the depths of the soul of man here, the dark outer limits of his depravity. The developers want you to feel comfortable, not upset. They want you to have fun, which is why the trickster archetype is a good choice here. They can make trouble serve as an obstacle for our heroes to overcome without ever doing anything truly bad, anything that would really upset the audience. Something that surprised me about the Smithy Gang is how often they're not in the game at all. In some sections of the game, you will go a long time without seeing a single member of the gang. Instead, you'll be facing off against totally unrelated villains like Booster or Valentina, who are both really fun characters in their own right. I absolutely loved Booster in particular. He has so much personality. And in one episode, you even battle against a monster wedding cake that has come to life for no discernible reason whatsoever. Instead of being the primary threat, the Smithy Gang have a tendency to leap in at the last minute. Like you've already finished this chapter of the adventure, and then a member of the gang will drop by to serve as the final boss, even though they weren't involved at all beforehand. My favorite example of this is after an already pretty tough boss fight against this dragon, who then dies mid-fight and becomes an undead dragon, which is really cool by the way. After the fight is done and you think you've already won, the Axum Rangers, a group of Smithy Gang Power Ranger cosplayers, show up out of nowhere to steal your reward, setting up an even harder boss fight afterwards. weapons. From a gameplay perspective, this can be really fun. It adds an element of surprise and variety that would not be there otherwise. From a story perspective, it means our heroes are often confronting random antagonists that have not participated in the story at all up to that point, and have not had enough screen time for their characters to be properly developed. But that does not matter. Everything about the Smithy Gang is designed with gameplay in mind, starting with the most basic aspects of that design. The Smithy Gang are a group of living weapons. This allows for basically limitless variety in enemy design. There can be as many different kinds of Smithy Gang characters as there are different kinds of weapons in the world. And because this is a wacky cartoon world, their designs don't even have to make any sense. The developers are free to do literally anything. Your first time playing Super Mario RPG, you will never be able to guess what sort of enemy you will face next. An honorable samurai warrior, a broken down magical clock, a fez-wearing clown bottle thing that rides atop a giant cobra, why not? And the battles themselves always involve some kind of unique gameplay mechanic. You will almost never engage in just a simple, straightforward battle against a member of the Smithy Gang. There's always some kind of twist. For example, Bowyer can disable buttons on your controller, preventing you from using certain kinds of attacks or items controlled by those buttons. Each of the Axum Rangers have totally different abilities and attacks. Countdown changes which attacks he uses depending on what time it says on his clock face. I think this is what makes the Smithy Gang a good group of video game villains despite their lack of narrative depth. Their quality comes from their variety, both in design and in their gameplay mechanics. They are a really fun group of bad guys to confront. I think other villains in other Mario RPG titles are better written, like Count Bleck from Super Paper Mario or Ollie from the Origami King are definitely more compelling from a story perspective. But I don't think either of those villains are quite as interesting mechanically. The Smithy Gang really are masterful gameplay type villains. Before I end this short essay, we've got to talk about the big bad himself, Smithy, leader of the Smithy Gang. Appropriately, since the Smithy Gang are a group of living weapons, their leader is a blacksmith. Smithy himself forged every single other member of the Smithy Gang. This does bring up some interesting moral questions that are never explored in the game. Smithy is literally crafting new sentient life forms. That means he's some kind of god, right? He is a creator god. He is the god of weapons. He is the god of Weapon World, an entire dimension separate from the Mushroom Kingdom. This dimension is shown to be a wasteland, a scorched place littered with scrap, the refuse of Smithy's creations. There is no color here, no natural life, no comfort. It begs the question, did Smithy destroy this world in his efforts to fill the world full of weapons? The only part of Weapon World that isn't a total dump is Smithy's factory, a purely functional place, which exists only to manufacture more living weapons. There's nothing here designed for comfort or pleasure. It would suck to live in Weapon World. And moreover, he is definitely an evil god. He creates new life forms to be his slaves, to do his foul bidding, to serve in his army, to fight and die for him. He does not seem to care about his creations at all. He never expresses any sorrow at their demise. He just forges a new soldier to replace the fallen one. The writers never present any real motivation for him to invade the Toadstool dimension. He apparently does it for no reason other than to fill the world with weapons. He is just obsessed with weapons. I talked earlier about how I think the Smithy Gang are more mischievous than evil, but that does not apply to their leader. I think Smithy himself is definitely evil, even if still presented in a silly way. He's also a very traditional video game villain. He is the classic final boss, in the sense that you don't even see him until the end of the game, until you have defeated each of his lieutenants. The only things you'll know about him before he appears on screen is what little you can glean from his soldiers. And continuing the idea that this game cares a lot more about gameplay than story, Smithy is a fantastic final boss fight. He is surprisingly tough, far harder than any other boss fight in the game. Up to that point, not only does he use his ability to craft new living weapons mid-battle, which can quickly become overwhelming if you're not prepared, but he has like 5 different forms, all of which have completely different abilities, attacks, and weaknesses. He's the kind of final boss for which you actually need to use everything you've learned in the game in order to defeat. You need to become a master of this game's mechanics. I was shocked by how difficult this fight was. He totally kicked my butt. I actually had to go grind some levels and track down some legendary equipment before I was able to beat him. It's a really smart and satisfying final battle, one of the best in any Mario RPG game. Also, what the heck is going on in this boss arena? Midway through the battle, Smithy throws a tantrum and destroys his own factory, and then all the characters fall down into this bizarre space filled with giant Smithy heads. Are these the heads of his family? Other members of his species? Is Smithy the last living member of his race? Did he kill all the others? Is he trying to create a clone of himself? It is never explained, but it's definitely pretty weird. Like a lot of other video game villains, Smithy is ultimately self-defeating. In the end, he gets so angry over the meddling of the heroes that he overheats and explodes. He is destroyed as much by his inability to control his anger as he is by Mario's attacks. Thematically, it's always important that a villain is brought down by their own flaws. There's no such thing as a perfect villain, otherwise they wouldn't be villains. And that's all I have to say about the Smithy Gang. Not a lot of story, but still a really fun group of villains to face in battle. A remake of Paper Mario: The Thousand-Year Door is releasing next year, and I look forward to writing an essay examining the X-Nauts, the villains in that game, particularly to contrast the differences between how they are portrayed versus the Smithy Gang here. I think Sir Grotus and the Shadow Queen are very different kinds of villains, so it should be fun to look at them too, so look forward to that someday.